So here it is, guys, what you've been waiting for, today's message. Week 7 of King of Hearts, taken by our very own Mark Pomery.
Well, hey there, Elevate friends and family. Great to have you with us today for week 7 of a series that we've called King of Hearts, looking at the life and leadership of David and the lessons that we can learn from his life and leadership and apply them to our life and leadership today. So I don't really have time to do a full recap. I'll give a brief recap in a moment, but I certainly encourage you, if you've missed any of the first 6 messages, then either go back on this channel and watch them, or I encourage you, check out our podcast on any of the major podcast platforms. Just search Elevate Church Perth and we'll be there, and the first 6 messages of this series will be there. But I want to drop us straight in to the slice of history that we're going to take a deep dive into today. So you can pop open your smartphone and scan this flow code. It'll take you to 2 Samuel chapter 11. Or of course, you can just go straight to the Bible app or your Bible, 2 Samuel chapter 11. I'm going to be reading from the New Living Translation. But before I do, I promised you a brief recap. So let's kind of take a quick flyover of what we've covered so far and how David's life has played out up to this point. So he was in his late teens when God anointed him to become the next king of Israel. But whilst he was anointed, like God said, yeah, I'm choosing you to be the next king of Israel, he didn't immediately receive the appointment. And so he spent this time, many, many years, in the waiting room. And he waited well, and that was important. We covered that off. Now, one of his highlights is that he killed Goliath. You've probably heard of that slice of his life. Soon after, he spent a decade on the run, being hunted by the first king of Israel, King Saul. And yet, despite being hunted by the king, he continued to honor the king, and he continued to serve the king, and he continued to stay humble, and he continued to wait well, trusting in God's timing, that God would lift him up to the throne when he, God, was ready. When he became king, he brought the Ark of the Covenant, which is where the Israelites, the presence of God was. And so it's a box, and it had been out of Jerusalem, and he brought it back, and therefore the presence of God was right back in the epicenter of the nation of Israel. And in this period of his life, having finally become the king, Israel, who had been under King Saul's leadership, and the trajectory of King Saul's leadership was away from God, they now had a king, King David, who was a man after God's own heart, and he was going to lead them from that posture. However, David made one very, very poor decision and found himself in a mess. In fact, he was the king, and this was a momentous scandal. I mean, the type of scandal that I would say that even today, in our increasingly permissive culture, that if he'd made this mistake, it would have created a scandal that would have made the front page news. People would have been posting all over social media, can you believe the king did this? And many people would just have canceled him in today's culture because it was not good. So I'm going to pick up the timeline of David's life in spring. Now, spring was traditionally the time of the year where kings and their armies would go off to war. That's when they were trying to take new territory and defeat enemies. Only this year, David didn't go to battle with his army. David stayed at home in his palace. And literally, David found himself in a place he shouldn't have been. And that very decision paved the way to make it very easy for him to ultimately do something he shouldn't have done. And see, this is like kind of bonkers because David was a warrior. I mean, he's the guy that defeated Goliath when none of the trained enlisted soldiers would even tackle Goliath. And yet, he didn't go with his army. And quite plausibly, had he been where he was meant to be with his army, he may never have done the thing that ultimately he should not have done, that wound him up in the mess that I'm about to show you. So here we go. 2 Samuel 11. I'm going to pick it up in verse 2. Late one afternoon, after his midday rest, David got out of bed and was walking on the roof of the palace. As he looked out over the city, he noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking a bath. So David, he shouldn't have been there. He was where he shouldn't have been. And he noticed a woman that he should not have noticed. And he didn't just glance at her, he noticed her. Now, God, at this point, is quite likely screaming from heaven, David, step away from the roof. But he didn't. And this is a clue as to how sin often starts. Not with the actual sin, but with something, some fixation, some seemingly inconsequential decision that causes and leads us to a string of other poor decisions that will take us to doing something that's less than God's best. So at this point, David hasn't actually committed a sin, but he didn't turn away either. And had he turned away, then the sin and the mess could have been avoided. But nope, he noticed her. The first domino had toppled. Thankfully, God gave David another chance. See, a messenger came back and tried to stage an intervention. Because the messenger, he could see where this was going, because this is what happened next. David sent someone to find out who she was. And he was told she's Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. The wife, David, she's married. She's married to one of your soldiers. This was intended to be a very clear warning that she's off limits. But instead of heeding that warning, David sent for her, David slept with her, and set off a chain reaction that would actually categorize and characterize much of his life and leadership from this moment forward. Because sometime later, Bathsheba sent David a message. Guess what? I'm pregnant. This is not a drill. And it's like, for David, it's like, oh, I didn't actually plan for that. That was not my intention. Now, Bathsheba's husband Uriah, he was where David was meant to be. He was with the army fighting on the front lines of battle. David sent for him. Sent for him in what ultimately was David facing a hinge moment. Should I own up or should I cover up? And David chose to cover up. In fact, his motivation for summoning Uriah to come back home was he wanted Uriah to be at home in his own bed with his wife, and so that when the news, publicly, the news of Bathsheba being pregnant, it would just be assumed by Uriah and the people that the baby was his. Well, this plan didn't work for David because Uriah refused to go back home and sleep in his own bed. In fact, he said to the king, I cannot in all good conscience enjoy the creature comforts here while my brothers are out fighting on the front line. So instead of going home, he slept on the palace steps outside. Operation Cover Up, phase 1, unsuccessful. Well, David still has the option to own up, but he didn't choose that option. He continued to cover up, launched Operation Cover Up Phase 2. And in Phase 2, David handed Uriah a letter and instructed Uriah to go back to the front lines, to give the letter to the commander of the armies, a man named Joab. And what that letter contained was instructions from King David to the commander Joab that he was to place Uriah in the fiercest part of where the battles were taking place. And more so, that when the fighting really intensified, that Joab was to actually remove the remaining soldiers, leaving Uriah alone and exposed on the front lines of the battle. David gave that letter to Uriah. Uriah went back to the battle carrying his own death warrant, not even realizing it. And spoiler, that is exactly what happened. Uriah was killed on the front lines. So now King David, a man after God's own heart, is now an adulterer and a murderer. Well, Bathsheba, whose husband was just killed, she went into a period of mourning, as you'd expect. And at the end of this period of mourning, David launched Operation Cover Up Phase 3, where he actually married Bathsheba to kind of legitimize the child that she was giving birth to, and therefore it wouldn't be such a scandal, or maybe it wouldn't be a scandal at all. And David might have assumed his cover-up was successful, but the difference here is that whilst no one else knew, God knew. And God wasn't happy. In fact, God was pretty angry. And so God sent a spokesperson to confront the king. And this is what happened next. So the Lord sent Nathan the prophet to tell David this story. There were two men in a certain town. One was rich and one was poor. The rich man owned a great many sheep and cattle. The poor man owned nothing but one little lamb he'd bought. He raised that little lamb and it grew up with his children. It ate from the man's own plate and drank from his cup, and he cuddled it in his arms like a baby daughter. One day a guest arrived at the home of the rich man, but instead of killing an animal from his own flock or herd, he took the poor man's lamb and killed it and prepared it for his guest. Well, David was furious. As surely as the Lord lives, he vowed, any man who would do such a thing deserves to die. He must repay 4 lambs to the poor man for the one he stole and for having no pity. And then Nathan said to David, you are that man. Well, David realized that his cover-up was unsuccessful in the eyes of God. And thankfully, as a man after God's own heart, he confessed to Nathan, yes, I did these things. Guilty as charged. To which Nathan, on God's behalf, responded that God would forgive David and that there would be consequences. And this is very important for us to understand, that while God forgives, and I'm going to talk about how God ultimately restores when we turn back to Him, it doesn't mean that there's no consequences. It doesn't mean we're going to escape the pain of our poor decisions, the consequences of our sin. And I'm saying this because I kind of hope it would incentivize us to be less prone, less desiring to want to sin because of the consequences. See, we've often, for too long as the church, framed sin simply around the notion of right versus wrong. Don't think that, it's wrong. Don't say that, it's wrong. Don't do that, it's wrong. And yeah, it's wrong, but like I like to zoom out and think, why is it wrong? Why are the things that God says to us are out of bounds? He declares them out of bounds. Why does he declare them out of bounds? It's not just because they're wrong, it's because they will usher in, inevitably, consequences that God doesn't want for his children. They'll cause us to live at a lower altitude than God wants for us. They'll cause us to miss opportunities that God's prepared for us. They will cause us to experience pain that our loving Father would actually want us to avoid by not doing certain things, sin. Well, in David's case, it was horrendous. The consequence that God declared was that this new son that he'd had with Bathsheba was going to die. And David, as you kind of expect, freaked out. And he kind of took the nuclear option. He immediately started fasting for 7 days, and he spent that entire time pleading with God to spare his newborn son. But unfortunately for David, after 7 days, the son died. And then this bonkers thing happened next. Then David got up from the ground after his son had ultimately passed away, washed himself, put on lotions, and changed his clothes, and he went to the tabernacle and worshiped the Lord. This is a man after God's own heart, and this hinge moment was a turning point for David. It recalibrated the trajectory of his life and leadership. He put himself in position to begin the restoration process. But this baffled his advisors. They essentially said to him, look, you were kind of in a funk when your son was sick, but now that he's dead, you're kind of up and at him and you're moving on. And David essentially responded, yeah, like what's happened has happened. It wasn't good. It's not what I wanted, but I can't change it. I can't do anything about it. All I can do is I can start to move forward and allow God to begin the restoration process. And this really is a lesson for any of us who have ever made some mistake or mistakes, and sometimes quite egregious mistakes, and gotten stuck as a result. Stuck with the guilt, the shame, the regret, allowing what we've done to become quicksand. And yet David gives us this great example of we can't change what's already happened. What we can do is position ourselves before God to allow him to jumpstart the restoration process. And look, this might be a word for you today. Get up, get dressed, and position yourselves where God can begin your restoration process. This is what David did from that moment. This is what the restoration process looked like for him from that moment forward. And this is kind of a blueprint for us. The first thing that David did was he accepted responsibility. Yep, I did it. I've been doing some home reno projects for like the last 12 to 18 months, and projects that I haven't done previously. So look, full disclosure, I am regularly coming back with nicks and cuts and scrapes. And it's like, here's a little pro tip though. The thing I use, the remedy that I use is eucalyptus oil. It's a good Aussie thing to use. It is phenomenal. It works better to heal wounds than anything I've ever used in my life. But here's the thing you need to know if you ever want to try it, using eucalyptus oil on your open wounds. When you apply it, it stings. like a lot. And that's a bit like accepting responsibility. You know, it's vital to do it, but understand it's going to sting a little. It's going to make you look foolish for revealing what you've done. But you cannot skip this step. You've got to move from Operation Cover Up and launch Operation Own Up. And David did this. He confessed to Nathan. In fact, then David wrote this song to God in this experience. He wrote, "For I recognize my rebellion. It haunts me day and night. Against you and you alone have I sinned. I've done what's evil in your sight. You'll be proved right in what you say, and your judgment against me is just. I deserve it. I did the crime. I know I need to do the time. Guilty as charged." But this is critical. Just like in a home reno, it's critical in a heart reno that we need to start by identifying and accepting responsibility for what needs to be fixed. And then we need to let go of guilt. See, this is the quicksand. This is the tether. This is the thing that can hold us back from moving forward in the restoration process. You know, too many people get stuck in the guilt, letting what they did define them. You know, this kind of mental narrative, I did bad, therefore I am bad. And David did not deny what happened. He accepted responsibility, and then he put his heart in front of God and invited God to do some open heart surgery. This is what he continued to write to God. "Purify me from my sins, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I'll be whiter than snow. Oh, give me back my joy again. You have broken me, now let me rejoice. Don't keep looking at my sins. Remove the stain of my guilt. Create in me a clean heart, O God." And then we need to move. We need to get back on track. David continued his song, his prayer. "Unseal my lips, O Lord, that my mouth may praise you. You do not desire a sacrifice, or I would offer one." No, you don't want a burnt offering. The sacrifice you desire is a broken spirit. And you will not reject a broken and repentant heart. And this word repentant, I mean, it's kind of a churchy word. It simply means to turn around, like to do a 180. David had focused on Bathsheba, and that led him to do wrong by God, to do something less than God's best. And now he had to turn towards God, 180 degree, to allow God to do the restoration in him. And so, if that's you today, if you've made a mistake that you wonder if God is willing, let alone able, to forgive you for, if you think it's game over, if you think it's too hard, you're never going to come back from this, then my prayer for you is that David's example will show you that there is nothing too big, no sin too big that God can't forgive, no life so damaged that God can't ultimately